попрошу... Джон, ты сказал ему, что он говорит не больше 10 минут?
Нет, 20 минут.
20?
Да,
Хорошо.
У него
Ну, первый бой.
готовился к докладу.
Дай мне пару. Так, я выключить должна. Так, я вас попрошу тоже выключить все инструменты.
Please, so will you turn off your cell phone? I would like to. I wanted to really concentrate, please. So let's get to work. I wanted to talk about how this idea of this session came about. So why we decided to organize it, because we have a very close friend, and unfortunately he's in a traffic jam right now, and so he'll join us in 5-10 minutes, and Viktor Golyshev, one of the most wonderful persons, so he's a great translator of written from English into Russian, so literally translator, a wonderful literally translator and translator of literature, and he always presents us with wonderful books, and then all of a sudden he would draw our attention to prose and McEwan, and he translated so wonderful books of McEwan. And I visited London some time ago. I was meeting with Lloyd, my friend, and I said that this wonderful translations. So it would be great if it could be just transposed into the Russian language, and invite this wonderful person who wrote those books to Golitsyn, and then John promised that yes, I'll give it a try, and McEwan is here as a result. So he has been invited. He agreed, and I'd like to welcome with a round of applause. So a wonderful. British writer, Ian McEwan, and for us it's a great honor. And so he came a long distance jointly with his friend, an intellectual friend, Zachary leader, who is with us as well, Zachary leader. So who will make a presentation too. He's the official biographer of Sam, and so who you know very well because he's been translated into Russian. And for us it's a great honor as well, because this idea of this session, the whole point is to talk about freedom and personal responsibility, and generally about freedom. So Viktor Golyshev has joined us. And so we'll put it together next to Ian McEwan. I'll put him next to Ian McEwan. So let's welcome Viktor Golyshev as well. I'll be sitting next to Ian McEwan. And I remember I asked Mark Dadyan, so for some reason just he went through another door. So what I should say about Viktor Golyshev in presence of this audience who have not yet had a chance to read his wonderful translations, literary translations. And Mark Dadyan said, so tell him that he is the guardian of literature, as it is. He's the guardian of literature. And so I think that would be right. And John Lloyd, so he organized this meeting, and so we took time to prepare. So 3 months. It took us 3 months to prepare this meeting, and that is why this session is going to So we'll talk about personal freedom, personal responsibility. It has to do with this. Literature and culture, why? It's because we all, when we go to school, we understand to what extent culture matters for us to be modern people from the social, civic point of view. And so I think that I will just, St. John Lloyd will be moderating, and then, so you know him also, with Maxim Trudolubov will participate in this meeting as well, in the discussion as well, and who is doing the best paper, which is Vedomosti paper. So that's okay. Over to John. So as Lena was saying, so we're lucky because we have two leading writers, and so the biographer, so Zach Leader is a famous biographer and a famous novelist in Great Britain and in the world as well. And I'd like to follow up and say that they came to Russia to speak to you, naturally, but certainly they agree with the ideals and the way the Moscow school functions, and that's why they fall in with these ideas. So they are germane to these ideas. That's why they came. Now, just I will.
Your sets. Yeah. First, Zach is going to speak. Zach, as you've heard from Lena, from me, is a biographer, and he's the official biographer of Saul Bellow. Saul Bellow is one of the great American writers of this and past century. And he has, and Zach will speak about this, his past is in Russia. His family lived in St. Petersburg, and before that in the Pale of Settlement, who were Jewish. And then they emigrated, and Saul Bellow grew up until he was about 8 in Canada, and then went to the United States. So Zach will present that, and we'll have some reflections on Russia and the Russian soul. And then we'll go over to our panel, which I'll introduce when we come to that. So, and then what we want after people here have spoken, after Zach has spoken, and then again later after the break, when Ian will speak, we want you to come in with your comments and your questions, as I know you will. So first of all, Zach, many thanks for coming. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Is that right? I'm honored to come speak to you. I'm very grateful to John Lloyd, who I think invited me because he read the first chapter of my biography, which is coming out next year, in April 2015, which is the centenary of Saul Bellow's birth. The first chapter of the biography is entitled Russia, Abraham, and Abraham is the name of Bellow's father. Bellow was the only member of his family not to be born in Russia. His 2 older brothers and sister, and his parents were Russian. And I argue in the beginning of this biography that his Russian inheritance is important to him, both as a writer and as a man in his life at the desk and away from the desk. I want to begin, so I'll read little bits from the first chapter. I'll talk for about 35 minutes. But I want to begin with an anecdote that opens the biography in the introduction. You know, Bellow was probably the most decorated writer in American history. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He won 3 National Book Awards. He won a Pulitzer Prize. He won the Formentor Prize. He won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Gold Medal for the novel, rather a rare and distinguished degree. And the French Republic declared him Chevalier des Arts et Lettres. For most of his life, he was the most highly regarded novelist in the United States. But at his death in 2005, just before his death, on his deathbed in Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was coming in and out of consciousness, for a moment he looked up, and there a friend of his was sitting at his bedside, a professor of English at Brandeis University. The man's name was Eugene Goodhart. And Bello looked at him, his eyes opened, and said, "Was I a man or was I a jerk?" Now, jerk is a slang American phrase. It means a sort of fool, but a really irritating fool. And it's a Bello phrase. Bello's language is famed for bringing together the street and the ivory tower. He's a high cultural and low cultural mixer in a sort of zesty and energetic, but also sensitive and powerful way. But it's not jerk, that's not the word I'm interested in this context. The word I'm interested in is man. Was I a man or was I a jerk? Now, by man, in this context, Bello meant mensch, which is a Yiddish word, or he meant it as a Yiddish word. And a mensch is someone you can rely on, is someone with human qualities. A mensch is someone admirable, responsible, a person of character. Being a mensch need have nothing to do with success or status or wealth. What mattered at the end of his life, this anecdote seems to suggest, was the life he led as a man, okay? Which is important for a literary biographer who's trying to bring together the life as well as the work. Now, at this point, I want to move on to this is something I'll come back to in the talk, this business of what it is to be, what he felt it was to be a man. The first chapter, the chapter about Russia, doesn't begin in Russia, it begins in Montreal. And it's a story that I was told that was important in the Bello family. It's about a moment of domestic violence in the life of Bello's father. In the summer of 1923 in Montreal, the father, Abraham, was in trouble. He was deep in debt. He had a wife and 4 children to feed. He had failed in a succession of jobs. He failed as a farmer, as a baker, as a dry goods salesman, as a manufacturer, as a junk dealer, as a marriage broker, as an insurance broker. What he was doing at the time was trying to make a living as a bootlegger. It was the Prohibition time, and he was manufacturing bootleg whiskey, and he was trying to sell it both in Canada, but now, for a moment, he hoped to make a great giant sale and sell, to go down through New York and sell it to big, serious bootleggers in New York. So he took all the family's money, and with his partner, all of the partner's money, they rented a truck, and they made a huge amount of bootleg whiskey. And at nightfall, they headed for the border. The plan was to sell to rum runners or bootleggers from New York who were serious criminals. They never made it to the border. They were hijacked on the road. Everything was taken, the liquor, the truck. When Abraham tried to resist, he was beaten, tossed in a ditch, and left to find his way home on foot. The whole family knew about this planned sale, even 8-year-old Saul, who helped to paste fake labels on the whiskey bottles. When morning came and Abraham had not returned, Saul's older brother, a 15-year-old Maury, was sent to find him. He ran to the partner's place of work, and he waited. Eventually, he saw a figure in the distance, running, he said, like the demons of hell were following him. It was his father, in torn clothes, bloody, in tears. Reaching out to him, the boy said, "Pa, Pa, what's wrong?" And in the version of the story told me by Maury's son Joel, in quotes, Then my grandfather just beat the shit out of my father. Now, to explain this moment, you must know something of Abraham's history. He was born in Russia in 1881, the year of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. He was born on the border of Belarus and Latvia. His father was a man of great learning and fierce temper. He was a traveling salesman for a wholesale grocer, and this is what Bello's father did as well. He imported Spanish fruit, Turkish figs, and Egyptian onions for borscht. He had red in his beard, like all the men in the Bello family. He drove a hard bargain, and he was alleged to be an extremely learned man in the Talmud and the Torah. His son Abraham went to Hebrew school, and then he went to a yeshiva only briefly, but he was not a man much interested in learning. He was restless, a traveler, a good raconteur. He was quick to anger, very loving one minute, very angry the next. In a 1990 interview, Bello described his father as violent, strong, authoritarian. He seemed to us as children an angel of strength, beauty, and punishment. His affections were strong too. He was a passionate person. Elsewhere, he says he was a very brave person, a very feisty man. Enviably, I think. He was just willing to fight. He called him a furious man, whirling with impatience, a heavyweight tyrant, following the example of his father. Now, Bello's father, Abraham, married in 1905, and that was the year, of course, of great political unrest and widespread pogroms in Russia. And he and his wife moved from inside the Pale of Settlement, the area where most Jews were restricted, to St. Petersburg. And they moved there because they had bought forged papers. They were there illegally. In the period they lived in Petersburg, according to the narrator of one of Bello's novels, Mordai of Heartbreak, the city was, in quotes, a mixture of barbarism and worn-out humanist culture. Bello was especially interested in this novel by Andrei Bialy called Petersburg. And one of the reasons he was interested in it is because it is set in Petersburg from 1905 to 1913, which were exactly the years in which his family lived there. And those were the years in which his two older brothers and sister were born. If you know the novel, you'll remember it swarms with conspirators and terrorists and suspected terrorists and police informers and double agents. Now, Bello's father and mother weren't political in the least, but they lived a very anxiety-inducing existence. Bello describes his father in one of the novels in which his father is thinly fictionalized as nervous as a fox. And in later years, though Bello remembers that his mother talked of how wonderful it was in the Heim, in the homeland, Bello says, well, it was not the Heim or homeland for them. But they were affluent. They did well in Petersburg. They had servants. They had a coachman. They had fine linens. They owned a dacha, which apparently was in Finland. It was a golden time for my mother, said an interviewer. This is the time when the mother, whose name was Lesha, changed her name to Lisa, and when she first read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Yet fears of discovery or betrayal remained and were eventually realized. Sometime in 1912 or 1913, Abraham's illegal residence was made known to the authorities. He may have been informed on, or he may have been jailed for failing to pay a bribe, or he may have been late with a bribe, or he was implicated by forgers or their intermediaries. And there's even some possibility that he himself was charged for supplying false papers. And here we touch on a matter that I would imagine, is central to what the interests of this particular panel are. The question I would want to ask is, what would it have mattered if one could prove that Abraham Bello was a seller or supplier of illegal papers, as well as a purchaser? Would that make one think differently of him, or make him more of a criminal? The big criminal, his son said. He would bring out a tattered newspaper article that had a picture of him, of the father, and underneath it just said the title was "A Jew Escapes," and was all about his crimes. And he was always taking this out in Chicago, where they eventually moved from Montreal. And his son would say, "The big criminal, look where we came from. Look how fortunate we are," he would say. And the son said all he wanted to do was make a living. A Jew who wanted to make a living in Russia in 1905, certainly a good living, would be unlikely to get anywhere if he obeyed the law. To obey the law 35 years later would get him killed, as it did many of Abraham's and Lesh's relatives who remained behind the pale. The literature of Jewish criminality in St. Petersburg makes just this point. In novels, stories, and poems by or about Jews whose illegal residence and employment in the capital are their only or initial crimes. That an ambitious and energetic illegal resident such as Abraham might get involved in supplying forged papers or bribing officials is neither improbable nor, it could be argued, especially blameworthy, except insofar as it exposed him and his family to greater risk. This background of systematic discrimination and forced, some would say victimless, crime underlay not only Abraham's and his family's subsequent attitudes to the law and the state, but Bello's fascination in his fiction with those who lived outside the law. In his novel, The Ghostwriter, Philip Roth presents us with a character who's very much like Saul Bellow. It's pretty clear he's a sort of thinly fictionalized version of Saul Bellow. And the narrator of that novel, who's a character very much like Philip Roth, comments about this Bellow-like character that he was a New World cousin of Isaac Babel, by which he means the Isaac Babel of the Benya Krik stories about the Jewish mobster king of Odessa. Roth writes, the gloating, the gangsters, all those gigantic types. It isn't that he throws in sympathy with the brutes. It isn't that in Babel either. It's their awe of them. Even when they're appalled, they're in awe. Deep, reflective Jews, a little lovesick at the sound of all that un-Talmudic bone crunching. Sensitive Jewish sages, as Babel says, dying to climb trees. It's Babel's fascination with big-time Jewish criminals, with conscienceless Cossacks, with everybody who has had it his own way. Now, not having it his own way was the reality for Bellow's father in Montreal and in Russia, and it had its effect on all the members of the family, even after their various successes in Chicago. Just as they had to flee Petersburg, they had to flee Montreal when the agents of the revenue were after him for bootlegging, and he came illegally to Chicago. But in Chicago, at last, he made a success, and Bellow's brothers became very successful. They were very, very rich as well. The mature Saul Bellow was in his life, from early on, anything but powerless. He was a man who seemed, from the outside, to have had it his own way, more than most. But that is not how it felt to him, often enough for friends, relations, and colleagues to remark on it. Somehow, under deep layers, the old, irremovable feeling lurks that I am a born man slighted. I am a slightee. Bellow wrote that to a friend on the day he received a Guggenheim Fellowship, which at that time was a very high and lucrative honor to receive. But he still felt a slightee. Now, for all the systematic discrimination, for all the difficulties of a life for a Jew in the Pale of Settlement and beyond, Bellow was proud of his Russian heritage in literature, even in politics for a while, and in what he thought of as the Russian temperament. When he was in high school in Chicago, he and his friends, also the sons of Jewish immigrants from Russia, called themselves the Russian Literary Society. We were so Russian as adolescents, he told a friend. As an adolescent, I read an unusual number of Russian novels. I felt it was the Heimat, I felt it was my real home. The children of immigrants in my Chicago high school believed that they were somehow Russian, he writes in an essay of 1993. And while they studied their Macbeth and Milton's poetry, they read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as well, and then they went on inevitably to read Lenin's State and Revolution and the pamphlets of Trotsky. The influence of Russian literature on Bellow's writing is clear. Dostoevsky is the presiding spirit over his first two novels, and he remains a presence throughout his career. The English critic V.S. Pritchett identifies Dostoevsky's influence in the sense of looseness, timelessness, and space in Bellow's novels and stories, the room they find for philosophical and historical depth, for ideas and theories. It's also there, it could be argued, in the comic depiction, more pronounced in Bellow than in Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky nonetheless, of the fictional spokesman of these high-flown ideas and theories, even when the ideas and theories are most dangerous or pathological, they're always treated with a little bit of comedy. Tolstoy's influence was more diffuse, a matter of balance or objectivity, as in Bellow's attraction to an intimate knowledge of the world he deplores and seeks to rise above, the world of sensual glamour, of social sophistication and material power. He writes against all these qualities, but writes so intimately about them that you know he's been drawn to them. Pretty soon I'll be unassailable, he joked to a friend, and I can write philosophy like Tolstoy. He writes this in a letter when he was living in a handsome, ramshackle dacha-like house in rural New York, which he bought in 1956, a little, and I don't know if I can pronounce the name, Yasnia Polyana. And at that time he was married to his third wife. He had 5 wives. The third wife he especially liked because her name was Sandra Chakbasov, and it sounded very Russian to him. And also she didn't call herself Sandra, she called herself Sasha, and he thought this was absolutely terrific. So he was getting there. He was going to be a Tolstoy. In politics, the Russian influence also played a part. In a letter of 1990 to someone who had written to him from Eastern Europe, he said, "The great power of 1917 over us shouldn't be underestimated. Among the intellectuals, the revolution was the most prestigious event of the century, and Lenin had an enormous influence. Lenin the thinker, and Lenin as a most desirable human type, the chief representative of a modern intellect, and an example of how intellectuals might obtain political power. We, and I'm thinking of Jewish adolescents in Chicago in the 1930s, he writes, we drew the line at Stalin, and by the time the war began, we understood how wrong we had been about 1917. Marxism, Leninism fell away completely during and after World War II. From that time, the Soviet Union represented despotism in its most boring form." In terms of temperament, Bellow did not at all feel ashamed of his father's fierce and open expression of emotion, a quality he thought of as Russian as well as Jewish. He writes, "The Jews valued Russian emotionalism very much, as long as the emotionalism didn't turn into murder, as often happened." In a 1961 profile of Nikita Khrushchev, he locates the Soviet premier's power and appeal in his emotionalism. He says, "We in the West praise the gray dignity of our soft-spoken leaders, but in our hearts, we are suckers for passionate outbursts." For the Russian scholar in the novel Mordai of Heartbreak, the narrator, he says there's a special Russian asset, which is the belief that Russia is the homeland of the deeper and more sincere emotions. Dostoevsky, among others, promoted this reputation for unlimited passion. At the start of his first novel, Dangling Man, which came out in 1944, Bellow begins by taking aim at the sort of costive, curt, hard-boiled sentences of Hemingway, and very much against the sort of Mandarin allusiveness of T.S. Eliot. And he begins with a series of questions. He says, "Do you have feelings? There are correct and incorrect ways of indicating them. Do you have an inner life? It's nobody's business but your own. Do you have emotions? Strangle them. To agree, everyone in America obeys this code. If you have difficulties, grapple with them silently, goes one of our commandments. To hell with that. I intend to talk about mine." And that's how the novel begins. A final aspect of Bellow's Russian inheritance is the incongruity or unpredictability of the emotions expressed, as well as their intensity and openness. The volte-face, or unexpected turn from benevolence to cruelty and back, is, he believes, a stock feature of Russian life and letters. It is crucial, of course, to the power of the scene, the anecdote which opens my chapter on Russia, when Abraham, looking at the appealing words of inquiry from his son, beats him up. Now, unanticipated, disproportionate reactions, such as Abraham's, apparently have a name in Russian. Proizvol, is that it? Proizvol, of which no closer translation than arbitrariness suggests itself. Dostoevsky's novels are full of these reactions, as are Babel's stories. Both authors are drawn to the sorts of characters who produce these emotions, notably faux bonhommes, or malign buffoons. The prime example of this would be Fyodor Karamazov. And in his article about Khrushchev, Bellow compares Khrushchev to Fyodor Karamazov. All right. Now, at this point, and to end, it'll take about 5 minutes or so, I want to move more directly to the question of what it means for Bellow to be a man or a mensch. And I want to do so by reference to two works. A novel, his most controversial novel probably, called Mr. Samler's Planet, which came out in 1970, and a wonderful story called The Old System, which he wrote round about the same time and came out in 1968. In both these works, the narrators tell of a heroic figure in their lives. In Mr. Samler's Planet, this figure is Elia Gruner. He is the narrator's nephew. The narrator of Mr. Samler's Planet is Artur Samler, Artur named after Schopenhauer, a Polish Jew who fell in love with England, all things English, and lived as a correspondent for Polish newspapers in London in the 1930s, came back just before the war began, found himself in a concentration camp. His wife was murdered. He somehow or other escaped, and it's his nephew, a wealthy nephew in America, in New York, actually New Jersey, who rescues him from a deportation camp, brings him to live on the Upper West Side of New York near Columbia University, where he is appalled by everything he sees in the late 1960s. But he much admires this nephew of his who brought him over, who's a rich man, a doctor, a gynecologist. The other admired man in the story, The Old System, is someone, the narrator, who's a scientist, remembers from his childhood an older cousin, Cousin Isaac Brown, who is his idea of a mensch, of a man. In the old system, the narrator tells of spending his summers in the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York with his older and loved cousin Isaac and his other cousin Tina. Isaac, he says, embraced the values of the old system, the intuitive, traditional certainties. His sister Tina rebelled against them, but Bellow says she, deep down, felt them as well. In his youth in the 1920s, Isaac, in quotes, had a mature business face. He was born to be a man in the direct Old Testament sense, as that bird in the sycamore tree was born to fish in water. Isaac is a millionaire property developer, but for all his success in the New World, as a New World businessman, in quotes, the old country dignity was very firm and strong. He had the outlook of ancient generations on the New World. In Mr. Samler's Planet, the nephew, Elia Gruner, is also a millionaire and no less dignified an old system figure. He is, in quotes, devoted to ideas of conduct which seem discredited, which few people explicitly defended. As Cousin Isaac grows rich, he becomes more orthodox, an old-fashioned Jewish paterfamilias. He keeps a copy of the Psalms near him all the time, including in the glove compartment of his Cadillac. He does so as active worldly Jews had done for centuries. What set Isaac on the path to his millions was the purchase of a country club, a real estate deal of dubious legality. This country club excludes Jews, and as soon as he buys it, Isaac demolishes the country club and destroys its beautiful golf course and turns them into a shopping center. And the narrator thinks that the ugliness of this shopping center might be a revenge, an unconscious assertion of triumph against the people who excluded him in this WASP country club, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country club. But then he reflects again and he says all such shopping centers are ugly, so it wasn't that. Cousin Isaac goes on to fill the beautiful Mohawk Valley with housing developments. He is proud of his work, but he builds too densely. He's stingy with his land. Yet he's no miser personally. He lives modestly despite his Cadillac. Now, Cousin Isaac is, in essential ways in the story, untouched by the ugliness and corruption that not only surround him, but that he himself contributes to, or is obliged to contribute to. And this is true also of Elia Gruner, the gynecologist who became so rich. He became so rich initially by performing abortions for the mafia. He doesn't have a Cadillac, he has a Rolls Royce and a driver. And the driver used to drive for the gangster Lucky Luciano, okay? But this doesn't affect the narrator's sense that that his nephew is a mensch. How can that be? This is a point where I think I should cut a little bit and tell just one little anecdote, and that'll be the end. It has to do with Cousin Isaac is so rich that the governor of New York appoints him to a commission to look after the pollution of the Hudson River and the Mohawk River. So he agrees to go on this commission. A boat is sent by the Fish and Game Department, and Isaac and his fellow commissioners tour the Hudson River from Albany to Germantown. The towns were dumping raw sewage into the Mohawk and Hudson. You could watch it flow from giant pipes into the beautiful rivers. Many of the inhabitants of these towns live in dwellings built by Isaac, squalid settlements of which he was proud. He had been so proud. He is revolted by the pollution he sees, but his thoughts are elsewhere. His thoughts are with problems in his family. His thoughts are with God. What he thinks should be done about the pollution is hard to discern. The local communities expected the federal government to pay for sewage treatment, which Isaac thinks only fair since Internal Revenue took away to Washington billions in taxes, but left small money for the local authorities to do anything about the sewage. When no federal help was forthcoming, the local communities pumped their excrement into the rivers. The next sentence reads, Isaac, building along the Mohawk, had always taken this for granted. The interesting thing about the story is you can't tell whether what he means by taken this for granted is taken the polluting of the waterways for granted, or taken the assumption that Washington would help for granted. At the end of the boat trip, the state game commissioner fishes an eel from the Hudson and drops the eel on the deck. It was writhing towards the river in swift, powerful loops, tearing its skin on the planks, its crest of fin standing treff, unclean, not kosher, and slimy black, the perishing mouth open. Isaac registers the horror of the eel, then turns away, back to family troubles. Often during business, he thinks not only of the family, but of God at building sites. He says the Psalms, when I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Well, what I want to draw to your attention here is a notion of man or mensch presented to us in the novel and the story. The deficiencies or inadequacies of the notion are registered. Both the novel and the story refuse fully to endorse this vision of what a good man is, but they admire him. The components of this menschhood, of this man, is faith in a traditional God, okay, love of family, and care for the tribe, and only very secondarily, and with little optimism, concern for the wider community or for the state. Well, this, I would assume, is a gloomy message, rather along the lines of the talks I've heard so far in this gathering, but it is a message that Saul Bellow, one of the most intelligent of American novelists, found himself drawn to in the late 1960s and felt something of on his deathbed. So that's my story.
Zach, thank you very much for that extraordinary piece on Saul Bellow. We're going to turn over for a 5-minute piece from Yury Petrovich.
Чтобы было удобнее. Ну, я думаю, вы немножко.
So I hope I trust you're slightly baffled. You know, you invited an English writer. You heard a wonderful lecture about an U.S. American writer with of Russian descent, and who wrote about Russia, who thought about Russia, and influenced by Dostoevsky, ideas of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on. And now I was sitting back and thinking. Bellow was an American writer, and he was using the heritage cultural heritage of Russia. And along with that, he caught himself thinking that I thought that today in the morning we were talking about other things, heritage rather of Soviet type. And in this respect, let me quote a very brief three quotes from Russian poets who show, in fact, who depict, who reflect what we discuss. We use this word or expression. So who is the person you copy your life from? Or in Russian we say, do your life out of who? And for what's the purpose of our meetings and talks? Because all of us, we came here, like Dante said, so after passing half of our life track and finding ourselves in some dark forest. But I'm afraid this age is even far behind us. We are far advanced in the second half of our life, the track of our life. We got lost. We are looking for way out. And we are sure that a Russian Dante will appear, who will probably write another divine comedy, a modern divine comedy, to show the way out of the dead end, the stalemate we found ourselves in. And the lines I wanted to quote, one of them belonged to Nikolai Tikhonov, a Soviet poet. With the passion and energy, in these two lines, we judge who he wanted to remind. These people could be made into nails. You couldn't find harder nails in the world. So late 20s. You could make nails out of those people. So during the war, another young poet, Pavel Kogan, who was killed, so from my childhood, I hated oval. From early childhood, I was drawing an angle, but not ovals. And another poet who died of being drunk and fell down on his way home and was found dead. And Chukovsky wrote about him in his Leningrad Siege novel that was published after the war. When he got drunk as a soldier, he wrote wonderful poems, verse. He was fighting in the north, in Norway, and he has a breathtaking cycle, like measure of very breathtaking verse about the soldiers and the war. And he wrote from his biography, because it was an issue. It was painful for him. It's not just Pavel Shubin heartache. It's for all Russian men because the life was such that not many could stand it. And he wrote about himself horrible lines that have to do to those nails, nails made out of people's souls. So he vowed to kind of prevail over this desperation or the pain that he lived through. Lines like that. I forgot. When I remember, I'll continue. The previous lines about the oval just, kind of filled my mind. And so I was quoting it. So we invited in McEwan to make an attempt to understand and feel with this outstanding English writer who describes the English society, not historical, not Saul Bellow with his outstanding work, gigantic work. As a rule, his novels are short, 200, 150 pages, very concise, or rather remind detective stories, but not in a conventional sense. When in the detective stories you have some positive character, but I would say they remind, because he would collapse and overlap the biographies, the backgrounds, like Amsterdam, of 4 friends and their life friends. One of them is a composer, another is a journalist, the third is a foreign minister, fourth is an entrepreneur, and all of them meet at a funeral of a woman they were close to, they were intimate, and then a plot started, and a brilliant description of this conflict and drama about it, around it, and in the end, each of them, virtually all of them, commit suicide, except the entrepreneur, husband of the woman in question, whose funeral they attend. And when I was reading this, after I read this novel in the late 90s, and I thought, this is amazing. The English society that seems to us more refined or humane, comfortable for life, turns out no less complicated. And when we look at it through an artistic book, smart people, clever, intelligent people, quite mature, with a career and having completed something in life, they are still people with the emotions and virtues they possess. Do not help much to control their passions, and they still remain they still behave within their biographies and their passions, and this human bondage that probably is the same for everyone, and not by chance. When the human species, unlike the animals, we all belong to one species.
Hence, I think that each and every one of us arrives at the inevitable conclusion that we all belong to one and the same human race. But then why is it that we so often fail to reach agreements when we come together, when we do business, when we make an effort, when we conduct a project? Where is the potential, and what is the pool of our abilities or capacities to live in a more humane way? Why is it that we were having a conversation in the morning, we have gone through a day of sessions and lectures and presentations, we are it is not that we're immersed in pessimism. No, we are not disheartened. But when we listen to the opinions of the experts here, I think that the knowledge of how we live relieves us in part of the burden of this reality. Knowledge indeed imparts to us a certain energy to go forward. So we have invited our friends, and we have invited Ian McEwan to talk about something that we believe is very important, which is personal freedom and personal responsibility. I think that Ian will say a couple of words about himself, about his novels, and maybe about his last book. Thank you.
Also, could you first of all react to what Zach was saying about Bello, and then?
Yes, with pleasure. Is that working? Yes, good. Well, fascinating to get a preview of what's going to be a very significant biography of one of the key figures of 20th century literature. Saul Bellow means a great deal to me. Zach, in passing, right at the beginning of your presentation, you spoke of Saul Bellow's famous high and low quality, that he could be of the street and yet of the ivory tower. And I just want to stay with that, because in saying it's famous, it might not be famous to everyone in this room. And I think it is a most extraordinary quality. For British writers, it has a very, very special appeal. Class, social class, the stratification of society is something that both hampers our society in Britain, but it also is a subject. It has given the texture to some of the greatest of our 19th century novels, and it still remains an element of force in our own writing. We do not have the ease, none of us, I think, of my generation, of slipping so lightly between every level of society. The last writer, I think, who could do this in Britain was Charles Dickens. Saul Bellow has something profoundly in common to the English ear and the English eye with Dickens. To get the quality of the poorhouse and also every strata above it. There's a passage in my favorite Bellow novel, which is called Herzog. To me, it's I often have disputes with my writer friend Martin Amis, who always plumps for The Adventures of Augie March. I think Herzog is the more finished masterpiece, but it is in essence a divorce novel, a man reeling after divorce, writing letters in his mind to famous people, some living, some dead. And he has a lover whose character name I don't remember. Is she a florist, or she's someone who's...
Ramona.
Ramona. And one of the most, I think, perfect 10,000 words in contemporary fiction is to be found in the chapter when Herzog goes to visit Ramona, who adores him, who wants to marry him, who wants to settle him down, who distrusts his poetic wanderings of the mind. And Herzog, while she's preparing supper, goes into the bathroom to wash his hands. Now, it's absolutely typical of Bellow that in the few seconds that he has his hands under the tap, he then launches into a consideration of the human condition in the 20th century. It's a fabulous paragraph. I wish I'd called it off the internet to read you now. I pinched it once to use as the epigraph at the beginning of one of my novels called Saturday. But something you said in your speech brought it all back to me, because the very opening lines as he reaches for the soap is, what is it to be a man? In a century, in a city, in a time of abandoned hopes. And it's a reflection on all those things that you mentioned. The mensch, the man, the century, the disappointed hopes of a revolution that you touched on. And it's also a manifesto as to what literature has to rise to describe. So that's one point I wish to touch on. And the other thing that interested me greatly in what you say is the background of Bellow's life that gave him access to an obsession with and almost lyrical sense of criminality. At the opening of another favorite Bellow novel of mine, Humboldt's Gift, its hero, Charlie Citrine, has made a wrong move in a poker game. His friend advises him not to pay, and a low-lifer, a hoodlum, comes after him. First of all, forces him up to the top of a half-finished skyscraper. At another point, is threatening with a gun, and then suddenly ushers him into a lavatory because the hoodlum is so excited and nervous that he badly needs to defecate. And so Charlie Citrine is squashed into a cubicle while this man sits and does his business. And again, in a trance, just in a beautiful moment, Citrine, Bellow, reflects on what we share with all animals. And it's a wonderful lowering moment, but it's also a moment of great humor. Fascinating now at last, I never knew any of this, to have that criminality put in some kind of biographical context. But I wish, could you come back to that Bellow moment, pre-Ramona, one of the great love scenes too in Bello, I think, full of sweetness and affection, even as his mind is wandering.
Well, it is a... Is this on? Can you...
Yeah.
It is a terrific moment, and Ramona is a wonderful character. She's absolutely determined to marry him, and she cooks him shrimp Arnaud, and she wears frilly underwear, and she's prepared to massage his feet, and she'll do just absolutely everything for him. And he thinks this is terrific, but she won't solve the world's problems, which is what he needs. He needs someone who'll help him to solve the world's problems, and off he goes. This is a novel in which the narrative present is he has been going mad, this character, Herzog, and he spends his time writing letters of protest and inquiry to President Eisenhower, for instance, to Adlai Stevenson. Then he writes to dead philosophers, he writes to Nietzsche and Heidegger. He asks Heidegger, now, when was it exactly that we fell into the quotidian? What year was it? A sort of comic take on quite serious matters, and the way they go together are exhilarating. You're right to emphasize it. It's one of a number of virtues this novelist has, and I gather all his novels are in publication here, and I would recommend them to you. But the fact is, he did not have much faith in politics. He did not. He came from a world of liberal ideas, surrounded by liberal academics. Adlai Stevenson's hopes of becoming president. He wasn't interested in Adlai Stevenson at all. He was interested in the mob in Chicago. He was interested in Mayor Daley, a big sort of monster of a figure. And in this, it makes me think of the interest of Babel in the Cossacks, in these huge, great figures of power. What does one do? I mean, he feels then that to be a good person, to be a mensch, you must involve yourself in some other dimension. One of the reasons he liked Chicago was because most Chicagoans feel their city is corrupt. They're rather proud of it. Anyway, I veered off. I'm sorry.
No, that's to the point.
Maxime.
Максим Трудолюбов. Good evening. It is quite difficult to try and embed oneself into this conversation. I need a point to an entry point, really. I'm a journalist, and I'm writing about society and economy, what Zachary spoke about, this dichotomy of a man and a jerk, and the conclusions that one makes towards the end of one's life, talking about this feeling of commonality with one's family rather than with some set of abstract ideas. So the prevalence of the private over the public. I think, I'm inclined to think that today's Western society and today's Russian society are very different situations, both culturally and even temporarily, time-wise, precisely because if we look at such substantial statements by the Russian writers or cultural figures or film directors, we will see that the establishment of this connection with those who are close to us, the establishment of these private contacts and private relations with the few people belonging to one's family, and the ideals. In other words, through certain symbols, we are related to the Russian tradition. And the situation where we are today attests to the contradiction, we feel to be missing a link to our own country. This is a part of our reality. And I think that for a Western person, there is a certain link through institutions to the society. When a Western person is free to join a political party or to participate in the work of any organization, association, or professional or amateur. These things are taken for granted. Whereas in Russia, the set of such links and ties is compromised. It is underdeveloped. And it seems to me that that people from different layers of the society strive to come to the same conclusions, to try and understand how the society can be taught to have a better rapport to those abstract notions which make up the texture of our life. How we can build up the responsibility for what we do as citizens, as taxpayers. These things, unfortunately, have so far remained abstract, and it appears that we, as people who prefer to narrow our communication to the inner circle of family and friends, seem to be more disjoined from the country and the society. It may be that the historical moment that we are living through, this surge of the national sentiment, this surge of political sentiment may be in part an attempt of the government to create a better link between people, but I think that this attempt is not particularly happy, because it would not lead to long-term consequences. I think that creation of such links requires a lot a better understanding. So this is what I would like to say about this difference of the set of contacts or communications that we have in our life, that of our inner circle and that of our place in society. Something that only society can teach us. The set of links with some notions which made to seem in our routine life quite abstract, but still have relevance. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maxim. I have not read in McEwan's books in English, unfortunately, and my English is not as good, but I have read in McEwan's books in the brilliant translation of Viktor Golyshev, one of the most prominent figures in Russia's literary matters. I think we have had a very interesting, very important presentation by Zachary, by a leader who talked to us about Saul Bellow. This sense of association with the Russian roots, with his family, and the sense of minority of Saul Bellow's literary roots, harking back to the Russian literature. And of course, Saul Bellow may have well read most of his Russian literature in translation. But I think that if Saul Bellow had lived had continued to live in Russia, he would have well understood how much emotion and literature how rich Russia is in emotion and literature, but how lacking it is in many cases in reason and self-possession. I think that I could only live in Russia because I have. It would be very difficult to live in any other society because I come from this country. But I think that Maxim is also right in so far that the absence of such of this reason or logic indeed deprives us of an ability to live as a society on the whole. Only then, if we had had this link, we would have been able to actualize ourselves or to actuate ourselves and to live in a larger world than our little drawing rooms and circle of family and friends. How can we get to the further reaches of a more institutionalized society? But as I've written, as I've read in the books, we tend to idealize the life in other countries. We, especially when we lived behind the Iron Curtain, we thought, well, many people in the Soviet Union thought that the West is almost an ideal. And it was through the literature that we understood that people are very much the same. I think that Ian has a very important concept in his books showing us the world as he sees, stratified society, and how can one still strive for one's freedom depends on the life as. Yeah, Mark is there in the cabin. He has translated quite a few books into Russian. McEwan has an epigraph to one of his books, and I apologize for not having the text in front of me, so I will have to make an impromptu back translation, which is not very happy. But this is about the four friends, the four persons who have come together in this funeral of their beloved. They learn about themselves things, and while they have their social functions and social standing, but in the basis is the jealousy of them being or having been lovers of one and the same woman. Just a few lines. When I last saw Molly, she said, and they want to vex each other because there's a whole entanglement of passions and motives, and I'm sorry for having to back translate this into English, but when I saw Molly last, she said that you're an impotent and you've always been one. That's rubbish. She could have never said that. Of course, you will deny it. We can talk this over in front of the gentleman, or else you can say goodbye. So they have been vexing each other, and this conversation was very short and brisk, and they shook hands, and he said to his assistant, Mr. Linley has kindly agreed to attend the dinner. This might have been a code phrase, and Garman, having turned to them, said to the journalist, a prominent person, Clive Lingley, to emphasize the contradictions and to remain friends. Is this not the essence of a civilized life? When we have a member of the British Parliament sitting here next to me, a civilized life when the opposition and the pro-government party can go and have beer after a heated session at the Parliament is certainly better than what we hear from Mr. Zhirinovsky. But for personal freedom, there is still a lot to grow in every country. I think we only have time for maybe one question. Thank you very much. Svetlana Shmelyova from the alumnus for 2005. I'm very glad that we've had this very at the same time very relevant and very literary conversation. Yury Senokosov said that we as humans are very much alike, but how come that we have such rifts and chasms between us? But it appears to me that we see from literature that the difference is not just about in language and how we use words, how we add up words into phrases and sentences indeed determines in many ways our being, which is a living manifestation of the story of the Tower of Babel. Saying unhappy in saying I'm happy in English is quite a routine thing to say. In Russian, the phrase "я счастлив" would have had a totally different connotation. So it is certainly through language that we have our perceptions, and I'm very glad that this session has been about language in many ways, apart from it being about personal freedom and personal responsibilities. Thus the word justice may be very different in English or Russian. Or let us take the word together, or maybe let it be, come what come may. The words that may be quite unnoticed or insignificant in the English or French language, but have to have and have such a great urgency in the context of the Russian literary tradition. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Svetlana. Maria Stomina from Sverdlovsk region. I'm very thankful to the school, and Saturday is my favorite novel of Mr. McEwan. I have a question to you. How do you posit as a citizen and as an author, how do you stipulate the demarcation line between personal freedom and the interests of a society? And one question from Bashkiria. I have a question to Mr. McEwan. I have read your quote, that the time between the two books is something that you may refer to as a period of great indifference. But indeed, the periods or the dots in a line may well be the traces of the words that have never been uttered. So indeed, if one may think that an author writes one and the same book throughout his or her life, then the periods between the time when the books are conceived are not empty. They're not emasculated. They're vibrant, and they are.
And my question: what forces you just to sit down at your desk, and what makes you start working again? Yeah, отвечу.
I'll answer the second question first because it's slightly easier. I agree that period between writing books is crucial. In fact, one of the reasons I'm here is because I've just finished a book and I'm a free man. And it's a great privilege to come here. Principally, I'm here not to talk, but to listen. Well, I'll make a small presentation after our next cup of tea. I've spent my writing life trying not to write the same book over again. The one thing I'm very good at, I can say this myself, is not writing. I can go a year without writing. And during that time, I am something of a sponge. I make myself available, I travel, I read, I hang out with friends, and I do a lot of walking, hiking. My purpose is to become a slightly different person. The times will change me, things will move on, my own preoccupations will shift, and by the time I'm ready to start writing again, I have a slight shift of consciousness. If I could quote a lovely line borrowed from Chess by John Updike, a knight's move in consciousness. By the way, he just before he died, John Updike told me he'd pinched that from Nabokov. So everything leads back to Russia here. The balancing of personal freedom and the needs of others is not only a writerly problem, it's a problem of all citizens of an intact polis, of a state. If I can give you a non-biological answer to how people are shaped by their cultures, I do it in a small parallel. I used to live in a remote area of southern France. Note, there was about a 30-mile space between our house and the nearest town. And there was a single-track road to our house with passing places for cars. And in the early 70s when I went, it was typical for any French person who was coming the other way to feel real triumph if he forced you to move aside into one of the passing places. And soon I became a Frenchman. Soon I too saw this as a battle of wills. Now, as it happens in England, it's precisely the other way around. The person who is the politest is the one who wins, the one who pulls over so the other can pass. Slowly, the Frenchmen of this region in the Côte de l'Alsace became Englishmen. They became nicer. I don't know how it happened. It certainly wasn't anything to do with me. I fell in with the local traditions, and then when they began to shift, I very eagerly grasped the sense of a civil society, that the best way to let the traffic flow along this road was for everyone to compete, to be first, to be polite. And it's in this sense, I think, that cultures teach people how to be bad and good. Underlying that is our biological sameness. The range of our emotions are the same. We cannot read literature of 2,000 years ago without sharing something of a set of emotional familiarities. For example, when Ulysses returns after many years to Ithaca, and Penelope does not recognize him, he feels fury. They have a little marital row. We're reading of a marital row 2,700 years old, and we fully understand it. When Ulysses reveals himself by saying he knows how the marriage bed was made, and Penelope then weeps for forgiveness, and then they make up, the surge of emotion we feel, finally reconciliation, they're back together, again shows the extent to which, even across cultures, even across vast stretches of time, there is a fundamental range of human feeling that is shared and that literature can deliver us to.
Спасибо. Виктор Петрович, может быть, вам слово, если хотите.
I have two questions rather than comments. My first, as we know, that the British writers were involved in spycraft. Graham Greene and Ian Waugh. Jan Fleming was a professional. And I would like to ask. So then the writer is the most free person in the world, not in our country, but is the freest, so to say, a person. To what extent this cooperation turns him into a dependent functionary and denies him his freedom? And I mean the collaboration with a state organization, state agency. And so this, I talk about your penultimate novel, Sweet Tooth, because he's involved in this, he's not. The question is quite straightforward. To what extent the collaboration of a writer denies him his freedom? Responsibility, I know. So it's responsibility to your country, so this is all straightforward, it's understandable. As to at what level Mr. McEwan allows for a compromise on these issues?
I think there could be no compromise. This freedom is essential. The moment one compromises, or should I say, the moment one withdraws one's skepticism about power, I think you've lost that vital freedom that you refer to. So it's very important to not become a functionary of the state. And yet it fascinates me too, the compromises that people must make. And the heroine of my novel, to which you refer, Sweet Tooth, a young woman who joins MI5, our domestic intelligence agency, and goes to lure a novelist into a scheme to sort of encourage right-minded kind of writers who would be friendly to the government's position in the Cold War, is exactly the story of compromised freedom, of what it is to surrender. We are great creatures of self-persuading ourselves. I mean, self-persuasion, I think, is one of the most extraordinary, complex and interesting human devices by which we accommodate compromise. We can speak ourselves into most contorted positions, and I think, again, the novel is a perfectly devised machine, an instrument for investigating the fine print of those kinds of maneuvers.
Zach, do you want to come back before we go to the break?
Well, it's interesting, Ian's talk that there should be no compromise. I'm a writer of a quite lesser sort. I'm a biographer. I write about real writers. But often I find myself obliged to people I have interviewed who've told me things because I've gained their trust. And then I hear from my subjects disobliging things said about these people. And I often, as is appropriate for my sense of Saul Bellow, whose concerns are often more personal than political, I often wonder where my loyalties lie. I try to tell the truth, no matter how painful it is to those people who have helped me. But it is difficult, and there are circumstances in which my freedom is, I believe, compromised in the interests of my responsibility to living people. So my answer is slightly different from yours. I try as best as I can to give as full a picture as possible, but I don't want to cause unnecessary pain to people who have been helpful to me.
Спасибо. Так, у нас перерыв.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very sweet of you. And you've said very nice things about me, too. It's great.
What a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for coming.
That was okay?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Keep me, please. Oh, good. Will you consider?